Yeah, so how's things?
Yeah, good, good. Um,
Interesting times that we live in, to say
Stressful.
the least.
Yeah, just seeing what's emerging really as a result of the last year and a bit, I guess. Yeah,
Mm,
it's quite interesting seeing what's happening in organizations and what's coming alive and what's dying or the confusion. There's so much going on, isn't there?
mm. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, sort of invited you to sort of come along and just really have a sort of a conversation that I wanted to very much put the word out about you and about Loafspark, having seen the presentation that you did at
Yeah.
the Future Economy Network, and I'll just give that a bit of a shout out as well here. And the whole idea really being just kind of exploring this whole kind of new paradigm, I guess, for how we communicate in work with others, with
Mm.
stakeholders, with customers, with our staff, just as human beings kind of interacting in this whole different space. And I just thought it could be
Mm.
fascinating. It's one of those kind of topics that's really resonating with the people who listen to my podcast. And I get a
Yeah.
lot of feedback about the whole kind of human thing. And I tend to sort of trade on the word mindfulness. And I know that's a big thing. I want to explore that with you, and because I know it's a
Mhm.
thing for you as well.
Yeah.
But really, I just thought it would be a really nice opportunity to kind of sort of learn a little bit from you about kind of the work you're doing, and obviously give Loafspark and yourself a bit of a shout out here, because I know people will want to be connecting with you as a result of this. And just thought really kind of explore. I've got no specific kind of sort of interview questions as such, but I just really
Mm.
wanted to kind of chat through some of the topics that you kind of highlighted in your presentation, which
Yeah.
I know are really pertinent and timely right now, but at the same time, I think you can give a slightly different perspective than the way I talk about these things,
Mm.
which I know, for the people who listen to my podcast, it's going to be really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, sure, sure. Well, do you want to kind of just ask me, so let me turn that phone off as it's going to keep pinging. Do
Yeah,
you
and I
want to
think
just
just
kind of ask some
yeah, just
questions? Is kind of where you want
kind
to
of
frame it?
keeping it really kind of
Yeah.
informal, really. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things obviously that's really useful is to get a little bit of a sort of a background context, I guess, as to kind of really who you are if people don't know you, and kind of find out really what sort of brought you literally to here today, in terms of a little bit about your journey. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, kind of where did it all begin, and what kind of drew
Mm.
you into this space?
Okay, so I think it began when I left university many years ago now, and I realised, having a kind of a, a business and commercial degree, that I didn't really want to go and work for organisations that were just for profit. I just could not see the point. It just didn't make any sense to me at all. And I decided that I was going to use my skills and go and work for organisations that were doing great things in the world, that needed help in terms of how they were organised and their ways of working and that kind of stuff. So I spent my early career kind of really trying to find the right place, and it was impossible actually to find the right place. So I worked in charities, particularly overseas development, worked for local authorities, worked for further education, like all organisations that have more values or have more purpose in their work than making money. But the thing that I really missed was the commercial side. I couldn't, I've kind of commercially trained. I come from a long line of female entrepreneurs. I just missed that commercial side. And at that point, I think social enterprises didn't really exist. So it was, and I stumbled across Triodos Bank, which was almost 20 years ago now, and kind of thought, wow, suddenly there's an organization that has really strong purpose and values, and is also a commercial organization. It's making its own money, but it's not putting that as the first priority. So I was really interested and curious. So I started working for Triodos as their HR manager, I think it was back then, and really really started to understand how you bring those kind of deep values and purpose in an organization alive on the inside. So what does that look like? How do the ways of working, how do you do that with all the commercial stuff as well? So that really that's where it all started. And then I left there to go and cut my teeth in the world of mainstream finance, because I wanted to really understand how that whole system and how that environment and the big corporate money machine works. I really wanted to understand that from the inside. So I spent quite a few years doing that before returning to Triodos, and then I was there head of HR for 7 years, the last stint I did. And so that really, you know, again, it's about really bringing the purpose and the ways of working and compassion alive on the inside of an organization. And then I left Triodos just over 3 years ago and set up Loafspark, really to look at all of that. And then whilst I was transitioning, I also started a master's in psychological therapies and mindful approaches. So I'm still finishing it now. So I've spent quite, you know, the last kind of 4 or 5 years really studying mindfulness and compassion, and very much from a Buddhist psychology perspective, but I'm translating that into the commercial world in my research project. So what does compassion look like in organizations, and does it make any difference actually? Does it make any difference to what ultimately customers experience? So, you know, we change stuff from the inside, right? So people on the outside can experience that when they're interacting with us. So that's a question that I've held for quite a long time actually, is how do we become more compassionate as organizations, and almost proving that is an effective way of being and way of working, particularly as I mean, a lot of my work is still in mainstream finance space, and particularly, you know, in worlds that have really built up around competition, ego, winner takes all. You know, how do we kind of create more compassion in those types of environments, and ultimately what they're doing in the world, so they can start to question what they're doing in the world as well.
Well, that, if that's not a crusade, I don't think I know what a crusade is. That it's just one of those things that it's almost too big, isn't it? And I think what you're doing here, and I want to pick up on something that you've said there, which I think is potentially really fascinating, is this whole idea about this word inside. I think a lot of people almost forget that to be able to do this transition, as you say, there's lots of industries where, you know, the old paradigms, the old cultures very much still prevalent, not just existing, but it's just, this is the way we do business. So if we talk about the kind of inside and take that right back to self and say, okay, this can only start from actually inside me as a human being, me as an individual. It isn't about the business. It's not about the organization. It's actually about me, inside me. Am I driven by this? Does this really matter to me? Because unless I, me, ego self is actually bought into this, the business is only kind of a product of multiples of me. So it doesn't actually exist really as an entity. Well, it does on paper in a company's house, but it's not actually a thing. And I think lots of people kind of get lost that, oh, our business or our brand is kind of ecologically sound, we're sustainable, we've got all these great principles. Well, no, but the business is made up of selves, of egos, of people. So unless you begin there, unless I've got you wrong here, unless you begin there, this thing just is never going to fly.
Absolutely, and that is where it starts. So it starts with me. So a lot of my work is with leaders for that very reason. They have the biggest influence on a culture of an organization. So I think research shows that 30% of the culture is influenced by them and their style, and how others experience them. So that starts with me, you know, that's where it all begins. And whether that's whether I'm working with a leader that's developing a deeper connection to where they work and the purpose of where they work, or whether it's about developing a deeper connection to compassion and bringing more compassion to their work, they have to start with themselves, right? Because, you know, compassion's like it's like a bucket we can fill up, and, you know, when we're kind of more full, we have it to give an experience for others to experience it in us. But if we're empty, if we're running on empty, it doesn't come alive. And I think there's a couple of things to consider in that mix as well. And one is that, like, stress, overwork, stress is an inhibitor of compassion, and this is what a lot of the research is showing. So what's happening about that in our organizations, and also mindfulness is a facilitator of compassion. And I know there's a lot in the corporate space around, kind of well-being and mindfulness. And, I think my own view is that a lot of that is just sticking a plaster over a more systemic issue. And I am a trained mindfulness teacher. I did 2 years at Exeter University to train to be able to teach mindfulness. And I now purposely do not teach it in the corporate world because I do not believe it's the way forward. I think it's a sticky plaster. And I think really what we have to get to within organizations is really questioning this need for overwork, overload, which also comes back to self, right? So it's about, what is it in me that either buys into that culture or is expecting that of myself and others. And I think there's a lot in leadership around fear, being driven by fear of failure, fear of missing out, fear of not enough. There's a hell of a lot there around that drives our behavior, but we don't always see that. We're not always conscious of that, are we? So a lot of my work is unpicking some of that and really trying to help leaders bring more consciousness to actually what are their drivers and where is that coming from, and being much more aware of their mindsets and how they translate into their interactions and connections with others. So I do kind of work on that leadership level, but I also do work on the kind of cultural level as well. So working with the teams that would typically be responsible for the culture of an organization. And I think in the session I did, I shared a quite a simple picture of kind of like a systems framework. And, you've got that kind of mindset level, which drives everything, the me. But then there's also stuff, typically organizations do stuff around the kind of system, process, structure, framework level. So it's tweaking both of those, it's kind of working in both of those layers and the relationship one in between to kind of say, well, what do we tweak or what do we start? Because they both impact each other. It's all a bit messy, I suppose, this work. It's not neat and it's not linear. You don't start somewhere and you've got steps and hooray, you suddenly arrived. It's very messy and non-linear, and holding that actually for organizations is quite important. I think that's okay.
Over the years, when I kind of think back almost to the sort of person that you're describing there, who I think, in terms of a business person, is almost, if you think back sort of 10, 20 years, almost is a sort of a unique beast, because this is somebody who almost has to have the confidence to stand out and away from the pack and away from what we might term the norm, because the norm is about rewarding hard work, long hours, overcommitment. Oh yes, I can cope with and I'll use the word busy working lifestyle, and almost kind of rewarding that and seeing that as the positive, rather than what you're describing here, which is a much more, I'll use the word mindful, but actually what I mean is a conscious way of working, where you're just very aware of the moment, the impact you're having, and yes, the end results, but actually almost standing out as an individual. Are you seeing a sort of a transition between, what would have been somebody who was quite maverick really in an organization? I've got one person in mind from way back who really stood out. And, you could almost really admire that, the confidence of being able to do that in a very kind of ego-driven, results-driven organization. Really stood firm, and he was very committed. There are more people like that now. It's a more acceptable thing now, isn't it?
It is. And there's a lot there around vulnerabilities, and there's being able to be vulnerable as a leader and explore yourself. And there's more agency to do that now than there ever used to be, which is brilliant. And it's almost expected, particularly at senior levels, that you will explore yourself and your drivers and your motivation and in all that kind of stuff. And I think it's this, there's a real switch as well going on around. So you described those almost external rewards So, you know, people working for external reward and like pay and benefits and flexible working and all of that stuff that a good employer would do. But actually, I think what the shift that I'm seeing, which is really only just beginning, is how do we motivate people by using intrinsic means? So how do we shift that? So people really have a strong connection here, and they almost see some of their values mirrored in the organization they're working at, and it's creating something that's bigger than the walls of the organization. You know, it's creating something which I don't want to use the word movement, but it's getting on board with some of that stuff and kind of saying, well, this is how, you know, this is how I see the world and this is how I see myself in it, and my work is part of that too. And so it's doing that shift, and I think you're right. There's more allowance, there's more willingness to explore that, and almost when I see that happen in individuals, it's almost there's suddenly a trust in that it will work, and there's a trust in if we create the right conditions, then the results come. Yeah, rather than we just need to create the right results and we just need to do and spin plates to get those. It's almost striving, rather than striving for those, it's like almost stepping back and pausing and kind of saying, right, what conditions do we need which is going to bring that about, and how do we do that by looking after our people and our customers and our investors and doing and the environment and the wider communities as well. How do we kind of bring that all into the mix?
I love that word conditions that you used. It is almost kind of really emphasizing the relationship, isn't it? It becomes a conversation. It's not an us and them. It's not a hierarchy. It's not a I talk to my boss. It's almost like the word boss comes out of it. It's like, well, who wants to be bossed? Surely you want to be in an ecosystem where it doesn't necessarily have to be equal. You know, everybody has different experiences and wisdoms and skills, and it's just you're almost kind of playing to everybody's strengths, then rewarding those strengths, and then it's almost like you then take on a personal accountability for being part of that kind of, I guess, mix of stuff that happens, creates the conditions. By nature, it creates a culture. And from that, then you get these results, rather than this kind of hierarchical, old kind of industrial revolution kind of, yes, here's the boss, here are the workers, white collar, blue collar, blah, 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 all that very old school kind of mentality and way of thinking, driven by the numbers. Whereas actually this feels like it's driven by relationships. Yeah,
it really is. It really is. And that idea of, you know, even that word boss sounds really kind of old paradigm, doesn't it? And I think there is also, it's not just about organizations suddenly developing a big heart and saying, right, what, you know, we need to do things in this way because this is morally right, or it's the right thing to do for society. I think there's also a commercial need there as well. And, you know, to be very adaptable and flexible and to be able to respond quickly to changing environments and changing customer needs, we have to be hearing many voices in the organization. I talk quite a lot about few voices and many voices, and creating the conditions where those voices are heard and listened to and given responsibility for, you know, making the changes and having budgets, and, you know, so stuff doesn't have to go up this hierarchy to make decisions and to slowly come back down again. It's like, well, let's just do this stuff. Let's create greater trust. And how do we do that? Because that's ultimately what it's about. How do I trust you to make that decision with that £10,000 budget, you know? So it's kind of creating environments where it frees people. There's kind of much more a freeing, but also them coming together in terms of community, and there being that leader somewhere in the mix. But generally, I see them as kind of almost behind everyone. So, and it's just how I personally view leadership is almost like kind of serving everyone and to enable them to do and be their best. Yeah, it's not kind of, for me, it's not someone who's standing up at the front charging ahead about them. It's actually about everyone else, and their job is really to get everyone else working as effectively as possible under a shared goal or meaning. So yeah, you're right, it is about connection and relationships, and, you know, will people follow you or not as a leader? You know, if you don't have the same level of hierarchy and status and desk to stamp your fist on, so you know what, and so people follow people they like and know, and you can like someone and not all, I don't mean like as in kind of a sickly, yes, we always get on, but you can respect and like someone and still have an open, robust relationship at work with them too.
Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? I mean, I think, you know, sort of you and I kind of discussing it like this, it ticks so many boxes. And yet there are people, and I just, as you were describing it there, I was thinking, oh, I know somebody who I had a conversation with. They will obviously remain nameless because it would be mean to name and shame, but they were in quite a traditional industry. They were in a senior role. In fact, they were the lead in this particular organization. I won't even say the job title that they had, but it was a significant job title. And when I broached the subject, we were talking about internal communications and culture. And I broached the subject of, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if we were to invert, so turn upside down, the company structure in terms of who reports to who? So instead of having you at the top there and having this lovely little pyramid of all these people working underneath you, let's invert it, because you're saying you support your people. Let's turn it upside down. Let's have everybody who's on the front line at the top of the tree, and then you can be right at the bottom of the tree supporting everybody. And the look of horror on that person's face, I thought, to me, just summed up the fundamental challenge that I think we've got in preaching this story. Was because when he looked at it, he said, but I'm going to lose control.
Yes, exactly.
And that to me said everything about the biggest barrier that we've got here is its ego.
Absolutely.
Not ego in an I'm better than you kind of way, but just ego as in, yeah, but people won't recognize me. They won't treat me seriously. If I'm at the bottom of the tree, I spent all this time working up the ladder, and now you're telling me I've got to be at the bottom, supporting everyone. They won't listen to me. It's got to be a big problem here, hasn't it? In a
yeah, I think that's from what I see in my work is one of the biggest blockers is that the people being best served by the old paradigm tend to be ones at the top, particularly at the very top. And, you know, if they've got the most to, well, in their eyes, the most to lose, you know, through changing their organizations, and ultimately they've got the most to gain, but it's a scary, vulnerable place to be. Yeah. And they've got where they are through understanding and working within the old paradigm. So what do you do if you let go of all of that? What do I do? You know, what do I do now? I don't understand. So there's a lot of requires so much vulnerability in that kind of top person and their immediate team to be able to work through that. And you've got to work with the ones that are ready or willing to have a conversation around it. And I think there's a lot there about confidence and confidence in, you know, the ability to be a leader without a title, or the confidence to be, you know, a leader, authentically lead from your own heart as opposed to leading with a job title. And that's the switch. And I do believe that even in the organizations that have that at the top, there's still an opportunity really to kind of say, well, they won't be there forever. So, you know, who's coming up, and is it possible to even work with some of the layers which are coming up? So once they get to that place, they're ready to have that conversation.
So do you see this then kind of manifesting in reality in the short to medium term in organizations, I guess, that are kind of younger, more immature in terms of their structures and their processes? I'm talking about, you know, maybe a well-funded startup, for example, where it is a much flatter structure because of the, you know, coming out the other side of the pandemic. They're probably recruiting people who work completely remotely, maybe on the other side of the planet. So there isn't that kind of sort of, I don't know, legacy kind of structure that's going to be an inhibitor. So they do have the opportunity to kind of, you know, be a bit more innovative, a bit more fleet of foot. Would you imagine it being sort of that sort of younger, hungrier kind of environment that's going to see this happen faster than maybe a more traditional place?
So I think, yes, so it was, yeah, for sure it would happen faster in those kinds of environments because there's just less of them. You know, I think there's less bureaucracy, there's less hierarchy, it's easier to turn a younger or a smaller organization around for those reasons. But I'm also seeing it with large organizations wanting to go on that journey, and really challenging journey. So I'm currently working with one of the high street banks, and they've got 70,000 people around the UK and around the world. And they're so up for doing this work, but it's so challenging, and they describe it as turning an oil tanker around. And with all the kind of short-term, I think that short-term pressures that's put on the PLC world as well, it's quite a brave move to say, well, we're going to do something which requires much more longer-term thinking and is much more related to our impact in the planet and the world. And what does that look like in terms of our leadership and our style, and how we're able to hold some of our challenges without needing to fix all the time, sort and fix. And it's quite incredible to see some of the transition happening, but it's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen in a month, it's not going to happen in a year, it's going to take a good few years to turn an oil tanker around. So I think it's more about where's the energy to do it, and that can be anywhere. And it's just grabbing those opportunities. And I think particularly with the larger organizations, you imagine the impact that they can have by turning around, and also the role modeling for the rest of their industry that actually this stuff is possible, that they'll tend to all follow suit. So you could it's kind of like knocking dominoes down. Once the first one is done, the others will follow. I've no doubt about that. But it's that being brave and kind of standing around and saying, actually, this is important in the world, and we're going to try it at least. Yeah,
I know a lot of people who follow my podcast, and I'm very grateful for the regular listeners and people who contribute quite a lot. I know a lot of them aren't necessarily the top decision makers in an organization. Quite a few will be working in larger organizations. Do you see a pattern? Because a lot of people who have connected with me are kind of a like mind, so they kind of get what we're talking about. This will be resonating. I have no doubt at all they'll be thinking, yeah, I want to work for that kind of organization. Do you see any patterns? I'm just trying to help them, kind of almost help them to broach those first early steps of maybe raising this with a manager, or raising this with a team, or starting to introduce this to an organization which possibly isn't quite as aware as they might be personally. Do you see any kind of specific roles within larger organizations where this kind of falls on open ears, or maybe certain types of individuals who are more likely to be a sponsor, for example? Because you can't do this alone. And
no,
medium-sized organization and larger, you're going to really struggle to be banging the drum. So you need almost to get a sort of a team or a group of people around you to have these kind of conversations, possibly plus a more senior, in the old paradigm, but a more senior sponsor. Do you see those kinds of people coming out of any particular department or discipline?
In terms of the kind of will and energy, could be literally anywhere in the organization. In terms of kind of like people that are able to almost bring it together a bit more, probably the senior team, or if there's a member on the senior team. So I've seen it particularly under the sustainability banner. I've seen that work, and because there's obviously, they usually have a real interest in sustainability and what that means, and so that's quite a good way forward. But also in terms of like the kind of organizational development, learning and development, HR world as well, in terms of kind of getting people behind something, then that could be a good place to have a conversation. But it's more about, we go back to that kind of like systems theory model that I shared. It's more about kind of, so where are the relationships and how to have the conversations, and what does that look like, and how do you get this stuff on someone's radar, and whose radar does it need to be got onto if that's a particular interest that you have, and what kind of conversation can you have, and who else around you is feeling similarly as well, and joining forces that way. So I don't think there isn't a one size fits all, because in my experience there isn't a one size fits all culture. It's every organization is quite different, even if they're similar size and similar industry. they all have their own unique way of doing things. So it's figuring that out for your own organization and who's around, who you can talk to and get support from, and sponsor for something.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you think back about sort of 12 months ago when Mark Carney did that famous speech where he said, businesses who aren't sustainable in the widest sense will not be in business in the future. I think certainly a lot of people are kind of aware that they need to start taking this seriously, even if they're not necessarily supportive of it. Do you think, and it's interesting that you say about learning and development and the sort of the HR function, do you see this as being a little bit of a sort of an education piece, even dare I say a training piece, so that almost like being, if you're again thinking of my listeners here, if they're quite passionate about trying to introduce this into the organisation, could they maybe take on the role of almost like sort of thought leader, for example, rather than trying to sort of bash down sort of doors that are firmly shut? Could they come in with almost an education piece, sharing useful information, sharing statistics, very much the whole idea that organizations who do this stuff are more profitable. There's a lot of research coming out on that now, and actually being almost like the conduit of information, because that will surely build confidence, won't it, in maybe some of the more skeptical people who are hearing this and maybe not believing that what Mark Carney said is going to manifest even in their lifetime.
It will. I think I'm always a bit showing the benefits in some ways always useful, isn't it? And showing, statistics and balanced scorecard stuff is always quite useful. But I'm having worked in that environment for such a long time, I'm so aware of the pitfalls of it as well. And I believe, and what I've seen is what is so much stronger is storytelling. So, really about how do you share stories which really get to the heart. So a lot of my work, I work with the three layers of the head and the heart and the hands. And the head is all of the statistics, it's all of the logic, it's all of the costs, the benefits, the analysis. That's all at that layer. And the hands is the doing, is actually doing something, practically doing something. Then the heart layer is about me connecting my values to where I work, or just even connecting with someone because we share some values. And so stories bring the heart alive, and that's the thing which gives us meaning. So it's almost kind of like creating that through storytelling or sharing stories, I think is probably more powerful than the statistics, although you might need to back some of it up with statistics sometimes to kind of encourage the very hard-edged commercial types, but they're so easy to knock down. I put statistics up and then someone says, well, I found something that just says the opposite. But if you're sharing a story about how someone has been impacted in some way, that's just happened. Yeah, it kind of creates that empathy as well, and opens the heart up. Yeah, so I use storytelling a lot in my work.
Yeah, heart in business. I mean, that's a really, really interesting concept, isn't it, really? And I think a lot of people who have been very results driven, it's a big almost sort of world in between those two things about being results driven and heart driven. To me, 100% get it, totally see the value of it. The vulnerability that you talk about these are the only ways really that you can create a culture that allows this stuff to thrive. But I still see this kind of old paradigm sat there sort of shaking its head saying it'll never work, and it's a challenge, isn't it, really? Because it's almost of us and them. It's those who've had the vaccine versus those who haven't had the vaccine. It's those who believe in the new world versus those who are trying to go back to normal. And I use the controversial phrases that everyone's discussing right now. I think we're kind of there, aren't we? We're in this kind of place where, yes, there's people who totally get this heart-driven, sort of empathy, sort of led environment that we're trying to get into, and the ones who are just trying to preserve the status quo, what we've always had.
Yeah,
it's a hard dichotomy, really, isn't it?
And I think it's, we all have to do what authentically feels right for us. And so if, we can't change the whole world. I think it's about then finding, the people that are ready. And at some point, I'm sure there will be a tipping point, where it's almost like change doesn't happen overnight, particularly changing paradigms like that. So at some point, the old paradigm will become so redundant. People just be like, what, why, why are you even still there? What's, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, so it's about just working and finding the like intention to want to go on a journey around that with organizations, around more heart, and really exploring with that and trying to help them to bring that alive. I think that's all we can do, and just kind of keep trying for that, and it will happen. It will definitely happen, and people are really calling for it. And I've seen such a difference just in the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years, in terms of, so when I started doing my master's research, even using the word compassion in the businesses I was going and talking to about the research was just like, whoa. We're kind of in the commercial world here. That's a bit of an odd word. We don't, and even I had a couple say, we don't really want you to use that word. It's not appropriate to talk to our customers and use that word. And now suddenly things are opening up so much more. And I'm getting like people just contacting me out of the blue saying, I hear you do lots of work around compassion. Can you come and talk to us? And it's just, there's been quite a sea change, I think. And I think, being in lockdowns and, working over Zoom have really accelerated that. We're not in these kind of plush marble offices where everyone's suited and booted. We're sitting in front of the screen. We can see, as part of someone's house. There's a lot more of almost a human connection from that respect, even if physiologically we haven't got the human connection. So I think that's created it, and people kind of questioning, well, actually, we've just been living the last 14 months needing to show more compassion for each other because what's going on in the world, and realizing that's one of the things that is pulling us through and ensuring that society is held together. So we're kind of getting more used to the word and that way of being in our lives, and that's tipping over into our work.
And it's interesting when you go back to something you said right at the beginning of the conversation, that this kind of ripples all the way through to the customer. I think it's interesting that customers now in lots of industries with lots of types of products are actually looking at the kind of the brand credentials in terms of sourcing products, obviously carbon footprint, but also how people and culture kind of impacts on that. Do you see this as being almost for lots of organizations now, how they're going to trade with recruitment? So in other words, actually how they'll attract the best talent by actually showcasing who they are. The fact that they're a heart-driven, purpose-led organization becomes something that will attract, again, more of that kind of people to then be able to really almost fuel that culture and those conditions. Do you see this as being something that almost becomes more important than job title?
Yes, and it can. Yes, it does. It really does. So, so my time at Loafspark as the head of HR there. So there were people in my team who did recruitment, and that was, by far that's what people were interested in. They really got that organization, and it is amazing. It has an amazing brand. It does amazing things in the world for a bank, and it treats its people really well and really tries hard to connect their hearts to the work and what's happening in the world. And people would just literally come. You get people wanting jobs, and I know people that have waited years to try and get the right job at Triodos, because they knew what they wanted, they knew they needed to be there, and they just had to wait till that role was available. Or so you create that, and people do want to come. And I've also, recently there's been quite a bit in the press around, and the media around, toxic work cultures, and the big consultancy companies and what it's like to work there. And I meet so many people who spend 2 or 3 years working in that world. I just did it to get it on my CV, and then I'm gone. I'm not kind of working with those conditions forever, and they lose it. They just lose so much talent because they're not necessarily looking after people. That it's just a no-brainer. I don't understand why more organizations don't just do it. I guess it takes that kind of brave leap just to work in a slightly different way. But once it's out there that's how you work and what it's like to work there, people just come to you.
Yeah. So people are listening to this and thinking, actually it's time I started looking for those kinds of organizations. What you're saying is, yeah, they're already there, they're already doing great
Yeah,
stuff. So it's
yeah.
about opening your eyes, opening your mind, and opening your heart to actually, I need to change industry, I need to change title, I need to change discipline that I
Mm,
do. And I also need to change the organization because they're just not listening here. And I don't think they're going to in the medium
mm,
term. So I can go and find this elsewhere. And I think what we'll see is there is almost like this migration to these kinds of organizations for these kinds of
yeah,
people. Got to
there
be.
really is. And we see the Becorp movement has, phenomenally grown over the last few years, and people want that. They want to be recognised for being a great employer, but being a great brand, being a great business, creating great things in the world. So that's, if you want to, a good place to start if people are looking to move roles or organisations is look at the B Corp websites and see who's on there. And target those organizations, and because they will be doing this kind of work. They might not be perfect, but they will certainly be on some kind of journey and have more awareness of it and be doing that work.
Yeah, it's great. So there's so much opportunity, and people just need to have the confidence to take those next steps, I guess, really. That's brilliant. So if people are listening to this and thinking, oh my goodness, I need to kind of get in contact with Sarah because I need to read more about her work, and I need to actually maybe get her in for a conversation into our organization, how do they get in contact with you?
So the website is loafspark.com. And so there's contact details on there, or they can email me directly at sarah@loafspark.com.
Brilliant. That's really good. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm sure it's been really, really stimulating and confidence building for those who are kind of on the edge of, shall I broach this subject with my employer, and also organisations potentially already doing a part of that journey but just need to know where to go next. So thank you so much for sharing all your insights and wisdom with us today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.